Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Florence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast and to our journey through the early Renaissance in Italy. In our last episode, we talked about the rise of humanism and individualism in both art and literature, and I proposed that some of these cultural shifts may have been tied to the Black Death, that is, the bubonic plague that swept through Asia, Africa, and Europe, taking with it an unimaginably large number of people to their graves. I want to reiterate that when we look at the cultural changes before the High Renaissance, that is, the age of Leonardo da Vinci, roughly the end of the 1480s onward, in the end of the 15th century, we need to be loose with our concept of periodization, and that's why I think it's important that we talk about the middle and end of the 14th century. That's the 1300s, always keeping the Black Death in mind, which began in Europe around 1348. Also remember that Giotto was already deceased a decade before, and we talked about Giotto in the last episode. So the Black Death was not a primary cause of the rise of Renaissance humanism, but arguably it's an important factor in the mass reshaping of widespread cultural thought. And we saw that with Boccaccio and his Decameron. Very importantly, the Black Death of 1348 was not the last plague that affected Italy during the Renaissance, and that's important for our topic today, in addition to other major issues like war and mercantile problems. All of this is to say that I think this episode is a necessary intervention in the very pretty picture that I painted for you all in the introduction. I want us to think of those wonderful flourishings in art and literature, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Giotto, and all the rest, alongside what was still a very violent and dangerous world, full of health and economic disasters, political warmongers, pirates, and slavers, and really any other awful thing you can possibly imagine about Italy in the 1300s. The disease, known as the bubonic plague, is said to have entered Europe through any number of trade ports, but it's repeated to have been the port of Genova in northern Italy. Some also say Messina in Sicily. It really doesn't matter. Trade in the Mediterranean was vast and complicated. In the west, the Western Mediterranean, major ports like Pisa and Genova from Italy, Avignon in France, and Barcelona, Valencia, and Ibiza in Spain were in constant interchange. Trade networks by sea also included vessels from England and Flanders, that is modern-day Belgium, partially, where Bruges was a serious port of trade and exchange between England and the rest of the Mediterranean, which sailed down the Atlantic coast and entered the Western Mediterranean by what is now known as the Strait of Gibraltar. There were routes to Byzantine Constantinople as well, in the Baltics, and although there were a great deal of religious and cultural hostilities between Christian Europe and Christian Byzantium and the Islamic world of the Levant and North Africa, trade really did prosper between the Islamic and the Christian world, although there were reciprocal prejudices involved. But money is money, and this really should be thought of as a proto-capitalist society. Right? Just like we were looking at the proto-Renaissance, it's proto-capitalist as well. Already were merchants and bank branches established throughout Europe, and this will be important for us later, especially with the Bardi and the Peruzzi families of Florence, so put an asterisk on that. On these sea routes, merchants were subject to being attacked by pirates. They could have their ships looted, their merchandise stolen, they could be killed. It was a dangerous thing to be a merchant or a transporter of goods. And likewise, the trade of enslaved humans was a commonplace scenario in the 14th century. In Europe, the only qualifier was that they could not be Christian. So, although this was a loose rule, slaves were being taken from all over the Mediterranean and beyond. So even with open trade with the Muslim world, they were free to be attacked and enslaved on the open sea. So the open sea is this sort of dangerous space, but when you got to port, you could do your business, and vice versa. So you could capture Muslims because they were not Christians and you could enslave them. But you were also getting slaves started in from the Baltics, right? So pre-transatlantic slavery. That's what I'm talking about here. Pre this racial systemization of black people to be sold to the Americans for labor. It's not really the type of slavery we're talking about. It was not exactly race-based, but a matter of religious background and conquest. Merchants might hire a galley to run the coast of Africa and scoop up some slaves. Really awful. So, and again, one of these major slave trade movements was in the Baltics and in Spain as well. So even with the slave trade happening, with religious difference happening, the Levant, which is the Eastern Mediterranean, was a hub for the distribution of goods coming along trade routes from further east of Europe, such as China, which is actually the supposed origin of the bubonic plague. We know that the primary carrier of the disease was rats, rats with fleas. Rats enter new ships with cargo transfers, ports. Fleas bite rats. Plague-carrying fleas bite humans. Every point along these very complicated trade routes that span from China to England. Do we understand this? Right? The infected then developed what are called, I don't know how to even say this, buboes. I'm going to call them buboes, which is where I think the term boo-boo comes from. Like, oh, I got a boo-boo. It's actually from bubo, the plague bubbles. These are inflamed lymph nodes, typically in the armpits and in the groin area. And if you got bubonic plague, your mortality rate was very high. And they really had no idea what was causing the plague and what was making it spread. So one of the initial things they did was blame the Jews, as they do often in history, making them confess poisoning wells under torture. Oh, these mystic Jews have decided they're going to go and poison us, and they put this disease in our wells, and we're drinking the water, and now we're all dying. That was the idea, and they made them confess to this. Great number of the Jewish community in Poland today started with the exodus of Jews from Western Europe during the plague-related persecutions. They were given exile in Poland, and many went there, and that is another awful history that we do not cover in this podcast. Meanwhile, bodies were piling too high to perform common burial rites. Mass graves were accumulating. Often, unnamed deceased plague victims were being thrown into mass graves and presided over for communal burial. Like COVID today, after the initial powerful hit, the mass devastation of the disease lessened, but it did not go away. This is the most important point. While, yes, the devastation of the initial Black Death, right, between 1348 and 1350, in my opinion, no doubt had an effect on the future of European culture, but it was the following plague outbreaks that continued into the 15th century that have a more legible, direct effect on the cultural productions of the Renaissance. I want to be clear about this, guys. Bubonic plague outbreaks continued in Italy with regularity and frequency. Although they never got as bad as the Black Death of the 1340s, for each outbreak, we have to imagine absolute horror and dread, not only of experiencing a current outbreak of plague, but looking back to the past, knowing that the same devastation that had just happened 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years ago could happen again. Isn't that awful? So just in the last half of the 1300s, the plague returned in 1361, 1371, 1373, 1382, and again in 1398. And these outbreaks can last for a long time, and they are not always everywhere in Europe. And that's an outbreak per decade. Just in Florence, just Florence, the 15th century saw major outbreaks in 1430, 1437, 1449, all the way into 1478, and then another major outbreak in 1527. Okay, so this is not going away. Not only did these outbreaks kill kings, queens, princesses, which is shaking up all of the royal alliances that governed power throughout Europe. But remember, we also lost artists. Giorgione, we remember Giorgione in Venice, he died of the plague in 1510. I did a whole treatment of plague islands in Venice in an earlier episode, so you should go check that out if it interests you. We also saw the rise of certain saint devotions around plague anxieties, that's such as Saint Sebastian. Importantly, Saint Roche. I think it's Roche, and I'm going to say Roche. So Saint Roche was actually alive during the plague years of the Black Death, the first major plague. He was practicing, say, theologian who was trying to heal sick plague victims. And he came to Italy and he worked on trying to heal the victims of the bubonic plague. And his tomb is in Venice, where a large cult developed around him, including a large amount of visual material. So, St. Roche, one example of many that shows the enduring impact of the Black Death, is Titian. We love Titian, don't we? Titian's Saint Mark Enthroned. Okay, this is a painting in Church of Santa Maria della Salute. That is Saint Mary of Health. That's important. The painting was done about 1510, same year that Giorgione died, right? One of Titian's mentors and contemporaries. And this painting of Saint Mark Enthroned actually has Saint Sebastian, one of the plague saints, and Saint Roche together with Saint Mark enthroned. Roche, as is the tradition, is shown pointing to a plague bubo on his inner thigh. He always, typically, not always, typically has the plague bubo on his thigh to show that he's a plague saint, right? And you can see these actually quite a lot in Venice. And just a brief aside, Santa Maria della Salute, the church that this painting is actually a Baroque church by the architect Baldassare Longhena and was known as a plague church since it was built in response to another outbreak of plague in 1630. Okay, that is to say that the impact of the plague on art has a very long history, and this little aside in Venice is only one of them. You look at this work, it's quite remarkable. You have St. Mark high above. To his right are Roche and Sebastian. They are, well, I guess it's our right, his left. They are paired together because they implicitly speak to anxieties about the Black Death, in so much that the plague bubo is being represented in a holy work of art, in a religious work of art, because there were religious and social anxieties around death by illness in this period. And this is becoming manifest in major works of art by masters like Titian. The precise visual history of the plague really emerges in the 15th century, which is a result of the reoccurrence of the bubonic plague. So when you look for plague art, you really don't find a large body from the plague years or immediately after. It takes until the subsequent outbreaks in the 15th century for that to happen. In France and Germany, you get the Danse Macabre, which is a really, really fascinating art motif in which every facet of society dances with death. We call it the Dance of Death. It's also an Iron Maiden song if you like metal music, and it's very good. And it is the clergy, the emperor, the pope. They are all seen being led to their graves. It is that all are equal in the eyes of death. Among the most magnificent examples of painting in Italy that is probably directly inspired from the Danse Macabre and plague culture is found in Palermo in Sicily from the year roughly 1440. So we're within 100 years of the first plague outbreak, but as we said, there have been 15 since, right? The painting I'm talking about is called The Triumph of Death. It's a fresco originally in the Palazzo Sclafani, but has since been moved to the Museo Regionale Arbetellis. While the transfer damaged the fresco, it's really kind of ugly what's happened to it. They divided it into four parts and then they reattached it, but the conservation did not preserve the cross section of the four parts being cut so you can clearly see it, but the actual image of what's going on is very clear. Death rides in on a skeletal horse. It's quite different from the Danse Macabre, who chose a sort of whimsical relationship with death as it takes the Pope by the hand and walks him into his grave dancing. Here, death on a skeletal horse with a scythe at his hip, right? He is the reaper of souls. We know this tradition, and here it's appearing in the 1440s, and he rides in on a horse and he barrels through this party of noble people who are enclosed in a garden. Who is below the hooves of death's horse but the king, cardinal, any type of religious member identified by their hats, the king by his crown, who sits there right in the middle of the dead bodies with glazed over eyes. Women weep all around, dead pale faces, and and around death, people seem to be cowering before him or paying reverence, except this older man in the bottom left-hand corner, who's sort of scowling at him the way the Florentine barista scowls at tourists asking for a macchiato like that. And above, there's this gorgeous fountain, and someone is playing music as if they're unaware, unaware that death is riding through yet. But it also plays to the sort of musicality of the Danse Macabre that is probably being inherited from Northern Europe. It really is a magnificent work of art. It's got movement and liveliness, what is horrific to behold. But what is it saying, ultimately, is that death is indifferent. Class, status, wealth, gender, power. It is here to claim all, and it can do it suddenly, and it can do it with mass casualties. This is plague anxiety.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
Meanwhile, other 14th century catastrophes plagued Florence. In Northern Europe, King Edward III of England made a claim to the French throne, triggering the very famous 100 Years' War. Part of why it went on for 100 years is because there was a pause during the plague, okay? Like I mentioned earlier, we're in a proto-capitalist society, proto-capitalist Europe, and in this period, the gold florin, that is that coin minted in Florence, was a widely accepted currency in Europe, and many wealthy rulers were indebted to Florentine bankers. We talk about Florentine banks a lot in the 15th century. This was happening in the 14th century as well. Among the most powerful merchants and bankers in Florence were the Bardi and the Peruzzi family, who I mentioned earlier, and had banking branches all over the Mediterranean and beyond, particularly to the English throne. And now King Edward has made a claim to France and is starting a war. So the start of Edward III's war against France saw him default on his loans to the Bardi and the Peruzzi in 1345. That's 3 years before the Black Death arrives in Europe, causing the two banks to go bankrupt and disturbing the financial power hierarchy in Florence. right? So two of the biggest banks in Florence go bankrupt because King Edward III started a war, the Hundred Years' War against France, defaulted on his loans of some, what was it, 600,000 silver florins and 900,000 silver florins. That's a lot of money. Please don't send me a message asking me what it converts to in current money. I don't know. And so now these big families that had all of this Florentine money poured into England have not gotten it back. And that is a critical financial blow to Florence and to their families, right? But the Bardi and the Pruzzi, they don't disappear. They actually bounce back. But the blow to their financial hold on Europe made room for the rise of other banking families, such as, take a wild guess who I'm about to talk about, the Medici, okay? The Medici started to step into the power vacuum, and then a generation later, Cosimo de' Medici, that's Cosimo the Elder, actually will marry Contessina de' Bardi, one of the women of the Bardi family, of the recovering Bardi family, right, in the 15th century. That's when their marriages, uniting their houses. So the Bardi unites with the Medici and really confirming Medici supremacy in Florence under Cosimo. I know that's hard to follow. Yes, King Edward III bankrupt the Bardi. By the time of Cosimo in the middle 15th century, they have bounced back somewhat because of their merchant assets, not their banking assets, and unites the family under Cosimo so that he can further ensure control over Florentine culture, society, and wealth. We have to think about how these alliances change the trajectory of cultural development, especially alongside the plague, which ended so many lives and power relations that these noble families were trying to make. And so you have a Hundred Years' War in England, you have bubonic plague every couple of years, and then to make matters even worse, in 1385, Gian Galeazzo Visconti snatched control of Milan and established a tyrannical order of conquest, hoping to unite all of northern Italy under his control. He quickly captured key cities like Verona and Padova, among many others. In 1390, Visconti made his first move against Florence. Now, he did lose the first war, but he came back in 1397, slowly conquering all of the most important areas around the Florentine Republic and Bologna, the two cities that stood against him with the most fervor. So Visconti took Pisa, Siena, and Lucca, and then Bologna fell to his forces, and he was prepared for complete conquest of Florence and northern Italy. Florence, who was in every way ideologically opposed to Visconti's method of rule. Remember, it's a supposed republic, that's what we call it, that's what they called it, where civic humanism was emerging around the democratic and republican ideals of antiquity, and here comes Visconti hoping to subject them to his monarchical rule. However, if you were listening closely earlier, you would remember that plague outbreaks were occurring with frequency. I'm tying this all together, guys. Gian Galeazzo Visconti died suddenly of the plague in September in 1402 while his forces were set to capture Florence. Gian Galeazzo Visconti dies, and there's a power vacuum between his descendants, and in the power vacuum that followed, liberated Florence from the threat of conquest. Imagine not only the relief, but the way in which this endurance of their perceived republican freedom might have enhanced the cultural morale of Florentine society. We're at the turn of the century, 1402, and the rise of the Renaissance, and Florence has seen itself on the verge of succumbing to a tyrant ruler, the greatest threat to their collective civic identity. Visconti wanted to establish an empire, a single northern Italy unified under his control. He would have done it too, if not for his death by the plague. To reiterate, that is a strain of plague 50 years after the first devastating Black Death. So as such, concepts of Florentine identity were developing along the lines of them seeing themselves as the triumphant last bastion of liberty, and even one that was divinely ordained, much in the way that the first wave of plague was often perceived as divine punishment. So Florence found a middle ground between their classical inspiration for a new civic identity with their Christian practice, justified what could be misperceived as pagan ideology, right? So in the end, that endured. And Florence could see itself as its enemy being struck down by the plague through divine intervention, therefore upholding this revival of pagan antiquity in their civic practices and culture practices. We see this in the choice of both David and Judith as symbols of the city, right? That being the Florence, the divine Florence as the bastion of freedom against tyranny. David and Judith, biblical characters, right? That is David who overthrew the tyrant Goliath, and Judith who slayed the Assyrian Holofernes. Donatello sculpts both Judith and David, right? And the David we should know pretty well, his bronze David in the Bargello. I'll not go into how the Medici used David to usurp that identity with their own tyrannical, excuse me. Of course, Michelangelo's David comes in 1504, which was originally commissioned as a symbol to counter Medici tyranny after Lorenzo the Magnificent died. I don't think he was perceived as a tyrant by most, by some, sure. Renaissance people, plague, banking disasters, war, these things all happened in tandem with the rise of humanism and what becomes the Italian Renaissance. The literature, the poetry, the advances in art and civic practice are not merely a spontaneous and clean cultural aspiration that I talked about in the last episode, but rather coincide with quite an alarming amount of death and tragedy and pirates and slaves and all of these horrible things that nobody likes anymore. Okay. This is not confined to Florence. We talked about Venice, we talked about Palermo, but it was the direct conflict between monarchy and, in Florence, intense republican ideals that caused such a strong cultural reaction in how we look at Florence as a center of the start of the Renaissance. I want to be clear that 14th and 15th century Italy was a volatile and dangerous place. The mortality rate was very high, and not only because of infant mortality, right? The trading routes were dangerous, war and plague were everywhere. Yet, within this chaos, individuals looked to make sense of their world, looking to the classical past for inspiration, believing it to be an age of stability and glory. Maybe that was Visconti's inspiration as well, believing he could unify Italy in the fashion of the Roman Empire. For Florence, it was the political ideals of Republican Rome instead. Okay, so still, while war and plague would not go away, nor would aggression from Milan, the rise of Cosimo de' Medici would enable some peace in Florence and see widespread competitive art and literary patronage that we inherit today as the core of Renaissance development. I hope this was an engaging and interesting episode for you all, and I want to thank you all for joining me. Please consider leaving the show a written review or a rating. It really helps. And come check us out on Instagram for episode-related images and much more. We have some fun stuff in store coming up, so stay tuned. Until next time, arrivederci.